Hey YouTube, in this video I'm going to be doing an overview of Gigabyte's X670 and X670E motherboards with the primary focus on building a new PC that excels at not just gaming but also content creation. So I feel like if you're looking at strictly a pure gaming PC and you're not really going to use the full functionality of what the X670 chipset offers, then you're probably better off with B650 or B650E, which we might cover in a future set of videos. But today we're going to be looking at X670 for content creation and gaming, because I do think that this platform is probably the most future-proof one available today if you are to compare this with either the B650 or with Intel's current offerings, the Z690 and Z790 as well. But we're going to take a look at X670 today, so that's going to be the focus. And we're going to be looking at Gigabyte's Aorus line, just like we did with ASRock. We're going to do the same thing now with Gigabyte. So we're going to look at their documentation, the block diagrams. So Gigabyte's done a very good job of providing all of that info. We're going to look at 3 motherboards, just like we did with ASRock. I do think that that keeps the video from being too long, so I don't really want to cover every single motherboard. If you guys have a question on a specific motherboard that I don't cover in this video, feel free to leave a comment below and I'll get back to that as soon as I can see it. So without further ado, let's get into it. So the first one here we're going to look at is the X670 Aorus Elite AX. So this one does not have the E, which means this one is not going to have a PCIe X16 Gen 5 slot for the top. It's going to be Gen 4. Kind of what I like to do is I do look at the product page like this to start, but really you want to look at the block diagram in the manual, because that's kind of where the real details are. That shows you if they are using all the resources, how they decided to allocate those resources. Are they wiring like rear USB ports to the primary chipset, or how many of them are going to the CPU direct, how many of them are going to the secondary chipset? So those are the sort of things that you get out of looking at the block diagram. So with that, let's go ahead and look at that. So this is kind of the motherboard, but let's look at the block diagram. So you'll find that in the manual, typically. So if you notice, they're using the Aorus Elite AX, but they also have Gaming X AX and Gaming X. So that tells me that they do have some lower cost options here that are probably more budget oriented. So a nice thing about all of these X670 motherboards from Gigabyte, as far as I know, they all include the Thunderbolt 4 and USB 4 header. So that over here on the right hand side, you can see there's that 5-pin header. So you can add a GC Maple Ridge add-in card, which includes the Intel Thunderbolt 4, the JHL8540 Thunderbolt 4 controller, which I have covered in separate videos. There's a lot of content on the channel now that covers this card in particular. But essentially, you can add this to the AM5 X670 motherboard. So that's really, really nice. So you go back to the motherboard. You can see the overall layout. 4 M.2 drives, dual chipset, so a primary and a secondary. And we're going to see what wires up where in a little bit here. But, you know, the typical layout. The one thing that I will point out that I don't like about this motherboard is it is lacking a postcode debug. For some reason, I don't know whose idea it was to make that a premium feature now, but a lot of these motherboards that are, you know, under $350, they all lack a postcode. So if we look at the price for this motherboard, this is a $289, so $290 at Newegg's pricing, and then Micro Center has the exact same pricing. But you can see it doesn't have that postcode, which is disappointing. I do kind of think that it would be nicer if, you know, I would say 250 and up would include that debug code, but apparently this one doesn't have that, so we're just going to kind of breeze through this here. So if we look at the block diagram, this is probably the most useful page in the entire manual because it does show you how things are laid out. So they are giving you a PCIe 5.0 bus with 4 lanes, and then they are wiring that to that top M.2 slot. So this motherboard does support a Gen 5 NVMe drive, but that's all you're going to get in terms of the PCIe 5 bandwidth. And that is because this is an X670 motherboard as opposed to an X670E motherboard, which would have a full 24 lanes of Gen 5. So the remaining 20 lanes are going to be PCIe Gen 4. So you can see your primary graphics card slot here. That's going to be Gen 4. And then you have an additional M.2 drive of Gen 4 bandwidth, X4. Two M.2 drives directly to the CPU, one of them being 5.0 capable, and the other one is Gen 4 capable. Then you have an HDMI port. You have the audio codec, so the rear audio, that does wire up to a USB port. Typically on Zen 5, that's going to be this single USB 2 port on the CPU interfaces there. And then you have a 2.0 hub, and you get some other USB ports that go directly to the CPU. So Gigabyte does a pretty good job of laying all this info out. You can see the TPM and the BIOS chip, those go to the CPU as well. Then you have 4 sticks of RAM, so you have the dual channel. It's pretty standard stuff. They don't really detail it as well as ASRock did in their block diagram, but this does look prettier, I'll say. It looks like it's easy to read, but it's less detailed overall compared to ASRock. So then you have a PCI X4 lanes going to the primary chipset. You're going to get a PCI Express 4.0 bus, as well as a 3.0 bus. But in the case of the primary chipset, what Gigabyte has done is they've taken all 4 of those Gen 4 lanes and they've added another M.2 drive. So it's going to be the first M.2 drive that goes to the chipset. That's going to be in the primary chipset. That's M2 CSB. So if you go back up here, that's going to be M2 CSB. So that M.2 here in the middle, that's going to be the primary chipset M.2. So it looks like the bottom one's probably going to be secondary chipset. And this one's to the CPU Gen 4. And this is to the CPU Gen 5. So for the PCIe 3, there's 4 lanes. All 4 lanes, each lane is dedicated to a SATA drive. So that's how they've allocated the Gen 3. Then you got a bunch of USB. But unlike ASRock, Gigabyte doesn't tell you which ones are going to the front panel and which ones are on the rear. So that is a little bit disappointing. You'd have to dig further into the documentation info in the manual or on the product page to determine which ones are front panel, which ones are rear panel. So again, not as good as ASRock in terms of documentation, but it is still a nice representation of how everything is wired. For the secondary chipset, you have a PCI Express bus that has 8 lanes available, and 4 of them go to a PCI Express X4 slot down at the bottom of the board. So that's going to be, if we go back to the product page, that's going to be this second slot here. Typically, if you go back to the manual, it would also say, so PCIe X4, so that's this one that goes to the X4 bus on the secondary chipset. So that would be really nice for the Thunderbolt add-in card. That's where you'd put that Thunderbolt add-in card, or a 4K 60 capture card, like an Elgato 4K 60 or an AverMedia Live Gamer 4K. Those sort of cards would go there. And then you have the 4th M.2 drive, which is also a Gen 4 drive capable slot, and that one's going to be on the secondary chipset. You have a bunch of more USB, a USB 20 gig port, another USB 20 gig port up there. And then you have a PCIe 3.0 bus, which has 4 lanes available. And they have taken 2 of those lanes and they've wired that to the bottom PCI Express slot. That's going to be this one down here. So that would be good for, some kind of a peripheral that you have, that maybe like a 1080p capture card or something, or something that only needs no more than 2 lanes of bandwidth, and it's Express 3.0 bandwidth, I might add. And then you have the Wi-Fi 6E and the Realtek 2.5 gig LAN port. Those are going to be each taking up a PCIe 3 lane. So overall, pretty straightforward motherboard. Every PCIe slot is accounted for. Nothing is wasted. Everything, tons of USB, lots of connectivity, lots of M.2, high storage. So nothing to criticize it here. The only thing that I don't like is the lack of that postcode debug LED, and this motherboard is under $300. But how it compares to what we looked at from ASRock, I do kind of think that the Steel Legend is probably better than this motherboard. primarily because the Steel Legend is an X670E motherboard for $10 more than this. You're getting the full 24 lanes of Gen 5, so I think that kind of makes it superior to this motherboard in terms of forward compatibility. So that's going to be it for the X670 Elite or the Aorus Elite. Now let's look at the Master. So this is going to be probably the middle. This is the middle of the line in terms of the pricing. So this is a $500 motherboard, so it is very expensive. But I do say it's middle of the line because Gigabyte does have one more motherboard that is more expensive than this one, and we'll look at that last. But this one I kind of think is the happy medium, or this is kind of the ultimate, where it's like if I was going to buy an X670E motherboard and I was going to buy from Gigabyte, this is probably the one that is going to be the main one that I'd look at. It is an ETX motherboard, so it's larger than your standard ATX, so that is something to keep in mind. But it does have the postcode, so at this price point, it better have the postcode, or it's basically a no-go. But this one does include that latch button that I have shown in a previous video that helps you disconnect the graphics card. It does have that really thick heat sink for the Gen 5 storage slot at the top there, as well as 6 SATA ports. So let's kind of go ahead and look at the block diagram. It is $500 though, both Newegg and Micro Center. But let's go ahead and dig right into the block diagram for the Aorus Master. So just like with the Elite, this one does include the Thunderbolt header. I do have a video for those interested in adding Thunderbolt to AM5. I do have a video specifically showing how to add this GC Maple Ridge card to that Aorus Master motherboard. And I actually detail how to install it and get it set up and everything. And I even show it working with a Live Gamer bolt. So let's kind of go down the block diagram now. So in the block diagram, so very, very similar to the Aorus Elite. Now what you'll notice that's different is the chipset or the CPU lanes now have the full 24 lanes. So you got 16 to the primary graphics card slot at the top here. Then you have 2 M.2 slots. So AMD kind of specifies that all vendors who make the motherboards need to provide at least one Gen 5 M.2 drive. That's because they kind of worked with Phison to develop those Gen 5 controllers. So it's kind of like the first one to market is probably going to be the Phison Gen 5 drives, which has been delayed multiple times, but they're supposedly going to be showing up soon. So one of them is supposed to be always Gen 5, so that is the reason why on the X670 board you get a Gen 5 drive, but the graphics card is going to be optional for Gen 5 if you're on X670. So, but this one, the Aorus Master, is an X670E motherboard, so it does have the full 24 lanes. If you add these up, 16 plus 4, that's 20, plus 4 more, that's 24. Now, however, these additional 4 lanes are, it's up to the motherboard manufacturer to decide what they want to do with these lanes. So in the case of Gigabyte, they're giving you a second Gen 5 capable drive. So that's a lot of like high-speed storage offerings there. Like, you know, that's really nice, and it's not stealing any resources from the GPU. The GPU is always going to be 16 lanes, no matter what. And then these two can give you like really, really fast NVMe drives. So then you get an HDMI 2.0 port, a DisplayPort 1.4 port. On the back of the motherboard, you have the BIOS, all this stuff, a bunch of USB ports that go straight to the CPU, so that's nice to see. Then you get your audio, which is also wired directly to the CPU as opposed to going through the chipset, so that's also nice. Moving on to the primary chipset, there are 4 lanes available of Gen 4. All of those have gone to the NVMe drive slot here, and then the PCIe 3 bus, all of those are going straight to the SATA drives. So just to reiterate for those that are kind of wondering how I'm able to know that, so if we look at the B650 chipset layout, which is essentially the primary and the secondary chipsets are each a B650 chipset. So if we look at the primary chipset, what we just showed was one M.2 drive that's taking these first set of yellow lanes. So lane 0, 1, 2, and 3, that corresponds to this M.2 slot. Then you have 4 lanes of Gen 3. Each one of those can be SATA, and there are 4 SATA drives. So that takes up all of these orange lanes, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Those are your 4 SATA ports. Then you have 4 more PCI Express lanes, 8, 9, 10, 11. But because the primary chipset, in all cases, has to connect to the secondary chipset, these second set of yellow lanes, 8, 9, 10, and 11, all go to the secondary chipset. So that's going to be this right here. That is the reason why, realistically, on the primary chipset, you only get 4 lanes of 4.0 bandwidth. Because the rest of them go to the secondary chipset. And then the remaining 4 are the lanes that uplink to the CPU. So 12, 13, 14, 15. Those are going to be the ones that go over here. So hopefully that kind of clears up any sort of confusion as to like how these lanes are derived. I mean, this Tech Power Up article does an excellent job with this diagram explaining how these lanes are allocated. So also your 2x2, so your 20 gig USB are typically also going to be off of the chipset. So here we have one right there, and then you have another one on the secondary chipset. Speaking of the secondary chipset, if you look down here, what we have is a 4.0 bus with 8 lanes. So that first set of yellow lanes, that's going to be the PCI Express X4 slot. So that would be this one here on the motherboard. That's where you plug in a capture card for 4K, for a PS5, or a Thunderbolt add-in card would also go there, or maybe if you want 10 gig networking. But I do think 10 gig networking technically can run off of 2 lanes of Gen 4. But yeah, so you could do that as well on this slot here. Then you get 4 more lanes, and that's going to be the 4th M.2 drive. So these two together are the second chipset's yellow lanes if we're using this Tech Power Up diagram. So how are we using the 3.0 lanes, which is lane 4, 5, 6, and 7? So those could be used as SATA, but what Gigabyte has done is they have allocated that for the networking. So one lane of Gen 3 is going to the Wi-Fi 6E, another lane is going to the Gigabit, the 2.5 gig LAN, and then they have a switch for the remaining 2 lanes that is shared between the bottom PCI Express X16 slot, which is wired for by2 electrically, and that is shared via that switch with 2 more SATA ports. So the last 2 SATA ports each have their own lanes, but if you want to use that bottom PCIe slot, which is probably more realistically what people are going to do, but I could be wrong, it depends on how much legacy storage you want to run off this board. But it is nice that you do get 6 SATA ports total. Just know that realistically it's more like 4 SATA ports off the primary chipset, and then if you're not going to use this bottom expansion slot, then you can get 2 more drives. So that's kind of how this board is wired. So that's going to be the master. So overall, that one's probably the most optimal in terms of the resource layout. And then if we look at the last motherboard, it's going to be the Aorus Xtreme. So this is a $700 motherboard. So this is the same price as the Asus Crosshair Hero. But I kind of see this as sort of overpriced. I don't really know why it's this expensive. Now they do include like a USB DAC or something that is in the box. But, you know, typically, you know, some people, depends on what they do, but some people probably already have their own USB DAC. Or they're just going to use the onboard audio. So I feel like that's kind of it's a small value add, but it's there. But then in terms of the motherboard layout here for the Xtreme, what makes this different from the other 2? So again, you still get the Thunderbolt header, so that's good to know. But then for the layout, what they've done, they've made it a little bit more unique than the Master. And I don't know if this is necessarily a good thing, but if we look at this here, what they've done is they're advertising this motherboard as 4 Gen 5 M.2 slots. So they have the 2 that typically go direct to the CPU, but then what they've done for the X16 is they're doing what is very commonly seen on the Z790 Intel motherboards that are typically paired up with a 13th gen Intel processors. What they're doing here though is they're peeling off lanes via a PLX switch, so that if you populate a 3rd or a 4th M.2 drive, so either the M2B CPU or M2C CPU. So either of these, this one, or it looks like it's B and C. So this one or this one, they are going to make your graphics card run at an X8 speed. So just be aware of that. This is a limitation for all of the Z790 motherboards. But Gigabyte, the Xtreme, for some reason does this, and the reason why they're doing this is because they can, that way they can try to sell the idea of 4 Gen 5 capable drives, but you are giving up half of the lanes to the graphics card, which might not be that big of a deal, especially if you had an actual Gen 5 GPU, but currently, at time of filming, right now all the graphics cards on the market are Gen 4 graphics cards, and that includes things like the RTX 4090. So, just know that if you have a 4090 and you populate these two M.2 drive slots, the 4090 is only going to be at PCIe 4.0 X8 in this motherboard. So that is something to point out. So you have the DisplayPort HDMI, just like with the master, and then the codec is also built in to that USB port, and then you have a bunch of USB. So nothing really different there. The primary chipset also is basically the same. So you have, the primary slot, the primary chipset is different than the master because now they give you an open X4 PCI Express slot off of the primary chipset, whereas on the master it was on the secondary chipset because the M.2 was down here. So because they have all the M.2 drives being driven off of the CPU, none of them are being driven off of the chipset, they can give you an expansion slot there. In fact, I'm a little bit interested to see like how they did a lot of their lane allocations. It's a little bit questionable. So 4 SATA for the PCI Express 3, and then on the secondary chipset you have a PCI Express 3.0 bus, which does offer 4 lanes, and the way that they have done it is 2 of the lanes go to a PCI Express X2 slot, so that's going to be that bottom one there. So it's worth noting that this upper one here, off the primary chipset, that's where you plug in like the 4K 60 capture card or the Thunderbolt add-in card. But then you do have this bottom one here for whatever peripheral you want to add or add-in card you want to add that uses 2 lanes of Gen 3. And then the other 2 lanes of Gen 3 are to 2 SATA ports. So unlike the master, which is splitting between the 4th and the 5th, or I guess the 5th and the 6th SATA port, and the PCI Express X2, the Xtreme doesn't share the bandwidth. They get their own dedicated lanes. So each SATA has 1 lane. So the total is 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So all the lanes on the Gen 3 bus are accounted for the secondary chipset. And then for the PCI Express 4.0 bus, you have 8 lanes available on this bus, but it looks like Gigabyte is only using 3 of the 8 lanes, which is interesting. So they have 2 of the lanes of 4.0 bandwidth driving a Marvell 10 gig LAN port, 1 lane for the PCIe or the Wi-Fi 6E, but then they have a whole bunch of lanes that aren't being used. So I do feel like this motherboard is actually really disappointing because I guess they wanted to advertise so much Gen 5, but they have a bunch of lanes down here on the secondary chipset that aren't actually wired to anything. They're only using 3 out of the 8 available lanes. I feel like they could have offered either like a 5th M.2 drive or dual LAN, or maybe another expansion slot or something. Like I feel like this is kind of wasted. So the fact that this is a $700 motherboard is very disappointing to see the way they've allocated that PCI Express 4.0 bus. So this one isn't really one that I would recommend for that reason, unless you really need that additional like 4 Gen 5 drives. So I don't know. To me, I would definitely prefer the master. I think this is a decent compromise of the sharing the 2 final SATA ports with that. I mean, you still get 4 regardless that can all do RAID. So I don't know. I just think that the Xtreme is kind of that's a huge oversight on Gigabyte's part, like a big waste of of PCIe 4.0 lanes. It could have gone to, you know, a 5th M.2 drive or something. So anyway, guys, that's going to be it from me for the Gigabyte motherboards, or the X670 and X670E motherboards from Gigabyte. Hope you guys found this video useful. If you have a question about any of these motherboards, or even a motherboard that we didn't cover in this video, leave a comment below, and I will get back to you as soon as I can see the comment. And if you guys like this content, this in-depth kind of deep dive format in terms of going over these motherboards, please leave a like. It does help me out. And if you want to see more, and if you want to get notified on when these videos go live or when they're uploaded, you know, hit that bell icon and subscribe if you like the content. And I will catch you guys in the next one. Thanks.